I wanted to talk a little bit about this article I read about the passing of the actress who played Alice on the Brady Bunch. Ann Davis died the other day. And for those of you who are too young to remember the Brady Bunch, it was a television show in the 1970s, popular when I was growing up. It was one of the shows I used to watch on Friday nights on ABC. I think it came on at 8 o'clock. And it was a story about, man and woman, each had 3 kids. They got married, and they all lived together. And the story focuses on the fact that the actress that died was their live-in housekeeper, Alice. And the point of the article is to point out how expensive it would be for a modern American family to have an Alice, and how completely unobtainable it is for most families. And the article points out that if you wanted to hire a live-in housekeeper today, you might expect to pay about $65,000 to $70,000 a year for your live-in housekeeper. Of course, that's hiring somebody legal, right? If you're living out in California and you're hiring an illegal Mexican, you're going to get them for a lot less money than that. But yes, if you're living here in Connecticut and you're going to hire somebody legally, that's what you're going to pay. You might be able to pay a little less, $50,000, $60,000, but it is very expensive. I mean, just housekeepers that don't even live in, want $40,000, $50,000 a year. And you would think, well, if they live in, you could pay them less because they give you room and board. They actually want more to live in. Most of them prefer to move out. And I mentioned that the reason for this is because most housekeepers are married. Because if they're not married, they're on welfare. You see, the people who used to have jobs as housekeepers no longer need to work as a housekeeper because they can make welfare. Here in Connecticut, if you're a single mother and you got a couple of kids, you can get $40,000, $45,000 a year tax-free on welfare. And so that individual is clearly not going to accept the job as a housekeeper for $40,000 or $50,000 a year and pay taxes and have to scrub my floors and wash my windows when she can watch television and collect $45,000 a year for doing nothing. Of course, the article doesn't point this out. It just mentions how unrealistic it is for a typical family to be able to afford a housekeeper when the typical family today, the typical guy, doesn't even earn as much as a housekeeper. Today, I think the average wage in the United States is about $36,000, $37,000 a year, which means the average housekeeper out-earns the average job. That's how expensive it is today to hire a housekeeper when a housekeeper earns more than the median income. Now, the guy that writes this seems to think that it was probably unlikely that even Mike Brady, as an architect, could have afforded a housekeeper with the minimum wage at $1.30 an hour. Of course he could have. I mean, that's only about $50 a week. I mean, at minimum wage, because the housekeepers today don't work for minimum wage. But if you paid a housekeeper minimum wage in 1969, I mean, I'm sure Mike Brady earned $20,000 a year, maybe $25,000 a year as an architect. He has a stay-at-home wife. Decent house. I mean, not nothing huge, not a mansion, 3-4 bedroom house. But I'm sure he earned enough money to afford a housekeeper. That was typical at that time. He even points out that if you paid the housekeeper minimum wage, he thinks it would be expensive. No, it wouldn't. It would have been $52 a week. And I'm sure Mike Brady, the architect, could have afforded it. But that's the way Americans lived. I mean, his wife, Carol, she didn't do the cleaning. She didn't do the marketing. She didn't do the cooking. All that stuff was done by Alice. And Carol didn't have a job. Mike covered everything. He covered the cost of his wife. He covered the housekeeper. He had the house. They had 2 cars. I don't know if they had, I doubt they had any credit card debt. I mean, it wasn't a huge house. I think it was 3 bedrooms. And, it was 3 bedrooms because all 3 boys and all 3 girls shared a bedroom, and then they had a joint bathroom. So they had 6 kids sharing one bathroom. But, Alice probably had a bedroom because she lived there. So they probably had a maid's quarters probably off the kitchen, which was pretty common back then in houses. The only time Greg, there was an episode, one of my favorite episodes, where Greg tried to move in. He moved into the attic. He set up a place out in the attic, but that was the only other place. Now, if it was today in America, Greg would be moving back into his parents' house and living in the attic because a third of Americans age 18 to 34 are now back with their parents, living in the basement or living in the attic or in their old rooms. So not only don't they have housekeepers, but they've got their grown kids living in their houses. But this was a common lifestyle. Americans had live-in help. And, you know, at one point, obviously the welfare benefits really began to increase, as did the minimum wage. But I think the biggest factor that is preventing young women from being housekeepers, which was they mainly filled those roles. I'm not saying you couldn't have a male housekeeper, but that would have been rare. Most housekeepers were women. Most of them were probably unmarried women at the time. But today, a lot of unmarried women that don't have skills, the type of people that would have become housekeepers, just have a couple of kids and go on welfare instead. And so the pool of potential housekeepers is no longer there. And so now you have people who used to be contributing members of society that used to help out in the house and make life easier for women who were trying to raise children. I mean, obviously, you know, they had 7 kids there. There's a lot to do. And so Carol could really appreciate all that extra help. Now, middle-class families, not only don't they have that help, but the Carol is off at a job too. She's working all day long. Mike's working all day long. They come home. There's no Alice. They both have to share in the house duties because even 2 of them together can't even afford a housekeeper. But Mike, working one job, could afford to pay the housekeeper while his wife stayed at home. That was America. That wasn't some science fiction fantasy. Like the guy that's writing this article is thinking that, well, that's just Hollywood, right? No, that was real life. That was what it was like. You know, and even way back, I mean, you look at all the apartments. I pointed this stuff out in my book, The Real Crash. All these pre-war apartments in New York on the West Side, they were all built for the middle class. They all have maids' quarters. It was very common. You go grab an old newspaper and look through the want ads. The most thing you'll see is domestic help. Housekeeper wanted, housekeeper wanted, housekeeper wanted. There were plenty of jobs. Nope, you didn't starve in America. You just got a job as a housekeeper because it came with room and board. You had a place to live. You had food. You just did housework. It wasn't difficult. But now, why would anybody do that when they could just go on welfare and not have to demean themselves to actually work for a living?